There is a legend that exists at the fringes of whispered thought across the Imperium. It is not recorded in any official tome, nor spoken aloud by the pious. It drifts like smoke through the minds of those who have seen too much, a forbidden question that gnaws at the edges of faith. Did the Emperor of Mankind possess a biomechanical core before the Golden Throne claimed his failing flesh? If he is the pinnacle of human potential, the epitome of unbroken will and divine purpose, why then do rumors persist of a false heart beating within his chest, constructed, not born? What secrets of the flesh did he bury beneath the veneer of godhood? To question the Emperor's form is to blaspheme in the eyes of the ecclesiarchy. But blasphemy has always been the seedbed of revelation. In the vast darkness of this dying galaxy, where truth is as mutable as the warp itself, perhaps the only way to understand his purpose is to peel back the myth and stare into the pulsing, forbidden mechanisms beneath. This is not an investigation of mere anatomy. It is a descent into the sacred machine, the secret soul, the possibility that before the throne, before the cataclysm of Horus, the Emperor's body may have been a carefully veiled lie. Before the thunderous march of legions, before the great crusade scarred the stars, there was a man, or at least something wearing the semblance of one. The Emperor of Mankind walked Terra not as a mythic god, but as a being of flesh and purpose, an unrelenting force cloaked in the illusion of humanity. His birth, if it can even be called that, is lost in the prehistoric mists of old Earth, an event either too sacred or too terrifying to be recorded. What little is whispered of it is shrouded in contradiction. Some claim he was born in Anatolia during the Age of Strife, others argue. His consciousness is the culmination of 1,000,000 shamans sacrificing themselves in unison to become a singular psychic entity. These theories contradict each other because they must. Truth and divinity cannot coexist peacefully in the Imperium. Yet, it is in those contradictions that we find the spark of possibility. If the Emperor is not merely a man, then what is he? More than a psyker, more than a warlord, more than a prophet, he is something wholly other. Some say he walked among humanity since before recorded history, subtly guiding, protecting, and shaping the fate of our species. Others argue he was a man who ascended, reforging his own form across centuries of war and evolution. Regardless, by the time he openly revealed himself during the Unification Wars, he was already something transcendent. But transcendent how? Through psychic dominance alone, or something else? Imagine for a moment a man who has walked 10,000 years before the birth of the Imperium, surviving the fall of civilizations, nuclear fires, and the psychic backlash of the warp's awakening. Such endurance would require more than simple regeneration or mental prowess. It implies reconstruction, upgrades, perhaps even a wholesale rejection of the frailties of flesh. Could the Emperor have replaced his own organs with devices of his own design? Not out of necessity, but to enhance the perfection of his mission? Could he have hidden behind skin and bone a core of silver and light, a beating machine heart that fueled his tireless drive? There is a strange beauty in that thought, the union of purpose and design, where biology yields not to decay, but to function. The Emperor as the first and last true transhuman, self-wrought and self-sustaining. Not merely a man with augmentations, but a template for a new form of being entirely. This would not be the cold bionics of the Mechanicum, obsessed with ritual and rust. It would be something far more elegant, subtle, an inner miracle veiled beneath living tissue. And that leads to an unsettling parallel. The Emperor, in this light, may not have simply ruled over the Mechanicum. He may have preceded them. The first tech priest, the archetype from which their dreams of divine machinery unknowingly descend. While they litanize over their broken relics and chant to ghosts of technology, he may have built a perfect biomechanical system within himself, millennia before Mars kindled its first forge temple. That would explain their reverence, their fear, their absolute submission to him. They saw not just a warlord, but a machine god, perfected. There are, of course, hints in the margins of forbidden texts. Words scratched into the data vaults of buried Mechanicum sects speak of the Emperor's internal Primaris engine, a term never fully explained. Others make veiled reference to the heart that does not beat, an object of ancient study hidden deep beneath the Sanctum Imperialis. And among the scattered records of the Unification Wars, there are curious omissions, battles where the Emperor suffered mortal wounds only to rise moments later untouched, not healed, rebooted. These tales are not doctrine. They are whispers, rumors, the heresies of madmen and visionaries. But the sheer persistence of these ideas across 10 millennia cannot be dismissed as coincidence. They cling to the Emperor's legend like shadows cling to light, constantly suppressed but never extinguished. If he was not entirely man to begin with, if he carried within him a false heart, be it mechanical, psychic, or something else altogether, then we must reconsider the very nature of his divinity. Was he a god because of his soul, or because of the machine he built to contain it? The Dark Age of technology remains one of the most haunting blanks in humanity's historical tapestry, a time when mankind reached its zenith, seeding galaxies, building artificial intelligences more brilliant than any organic mind, and reshaping flesh and steel into seamless unity. It is from this murky epoch that so many of our current horrors are born, but it is also the age in which the Emperor may have found, or forged, his internal sanctum, his biomechanical heart. In the void of certainty, speculation becomes a kind of ritual, and in this ritual we uncover shadows of astonishing possibility. What if the Emperor did not merely survive the Dark Age of technology, but was its architect, or perhaps its greatest product? He may have walked among the scientist kings of that era as an unseen steward, shaping humanity's ascent, subtly diverting catastrophe, and harvesting the most forbidden secrets when collapse came. There are scraps of half-burned records suggesting the existence of primordial engine cores, hyper-advanced self-sustaining systems capable of interfacing with both biological and psychic energies. These cores were rumored to be developed not for machines, but for post-organic life forms, beings who could abandon the entropy of flesh. Such a core could explain the Emperor's paradoxical physiology. He bleeds, he suffers, and yet he does not die, not in the way mortals do. There is a recurring notion among certain fringe Mechanicum cults that the Emperor possesses a sublime loop, a functionally immortal core that regulates his every system. If this is true, it would not be a crude machine pumping synthetic fluids. It would be an arcane miracle of pre-heresy science, humming with lost energies and quantum logic. An artifact so advanced that even the most sacred STCs would seem primitive in comparison. Consider the implications. A core not just mechanical but symphonic, designed to harmonize with the warp as well as with matter. This could account for the Emperor's unique psychic stability. While other psychers burn out, go mad, or are torn asunder by the immaterium, he remained a fixed point, an eye in the storm. If the core existed, it may have served as an anchor, tuning his psychic frequency to avoid corruption, much like the null fields used by the Sisters of Silence, but infinitely more refined. It could have been the heart of his resistance to chaos itself. There are relics from the Dark Age that hint at such things. The Noctis lexicon of Andor Hall, now destroyed, allegedly spoke of a man of gold whose chest held the pulse of all probability. A living engine, conscious yet subservient, that allowed this being to alter the fundamental decay of his cellular structure, to manipulate probability at the quantum level, to step beyond time without leaving the body behind. Was this poetic metaphor, or heavily encoded truth about the Emperor's inner workings? And what of the standard template constructs themselves? These fragments of a dead civilization are obsessed over by the Mechanicum, yet it is widely believed that none of the STCs discovered contain blueprints for modifying human biology to the extent seen in the Emperor. Could it be that such blueprints were purged, not by accident but by his hand? If he was the culmination of such technology, or worse, its prototype, then he alone would have reason to suppress it. It would not be fear but control. After all, a god needs no equals. There's also the tragedy of the men of iron, their rebellion, their fall. It was this cataclysm that buried the Dark Age beneath blood and ash. But what if the Emperor's true mission began here, in the moment humanity's machines turned against them? What if he realized that to lead mankind into the stars again, he had to become the bridge between machine and man? Not a man using tools, but a man who is the tool, a living manifesto of controlled ascension. That would mean the Emperor's core, if it exists, is not merely functional. It is symbolic, the embodiment of a philosophy, control, perfection, unity. Such thoughts are dangerous, of course. To speak of the Emperor as a product of the Dark Age of technology is to risk being labeled tech heresy of the highest order. But the symbols are too consistent, the silence is too loud. The Emperor may have worn the robes of a warlord, the armor of a conqueror, and the crown of a god. But beneath it all, something glowed. Something that hummed with the lost knowledge of a dead golden age. A heart that was not made of flesh, but of dream metal and electric light. There is a cruel irony at the heart of the Imperium's dogma. The flesh is sacred, yet so often discarded. The machine is impure, yet worshipped as divine. This paradox is not a contradiction, it is doctrine. And at the heart of this doctrine stands the Emperor, the ultimate embodiment of its hypocrisy, or perhaps its secret truth. For if he truly bore a biomechanical heart before the Golden Throne, then everything the ecclesiarchy teaches about purity, divinity, and the sanctity of human form collapses into beautiful blasphemy. The cult Mechanicus preaches that the machine is divine, yet incomplete without the human will to direct it. The ecclesiarchy, on the other hand, exalts the Emperor's humanity, his suffering, his martyrdom, his visible wounds, as evidence of his godhood. But what if both views are lies carved to fit a shattered truth? What if the Emperor's body was neither purely man nor purely machine, but an alchemical fusion of both, perfected in secret? A false heart, then, would not be a flaw but a feature, not heresy but hierarchy. To the Mechanicum, flesh is weak. This belief, however, is not universal. Certain divergent sects, those long purged or buried deep in the forges of Mars, once whispered of the divine synthesis, a state of being where flesh and machine do not compete but coalesce. They argued that to replace the heart with a machine was not to erase the soul, but to house it more perfectly. These sects revered the Emperor not as a man who ascended, but as a machine that remembered its origin in blood. Their texts, when they survive, speak of the Emperor's lamentation, not sorrow but song. A resonance said to pulse from within his chest like a second heartbeat, metallic and eternal. Imagine a heart that sings, that pulses with light instead of blood. One that sustains not just a body, but a legacy that serves as the anchor point for a divine will. Such a core would blur every line the ecclesiarchy fights to uphold. It would mean the Emperor is not a suffering martyr, but a perfected construct, and that changes everything. It makes him less relatable, perhaps, but more terrifying. Not a god in man's image, but a god that built his own image to command obedience. This leads us to the core question of imperial hypocrisy. If the Emperor bore within him a synthetic heart, designed, not grown, then why is cybernetic enhancement treated with such suspicion in the Adeptus Ministorum? Why is the flesh so revered in sermons, while augmented bodies are often seen as impure or worse, damned? The answer is control. The lie of sacred flesh exists to contain humanity, to keep it manageable, faithful, and blind. Only the Emperor was allowed to transcend that line, because he wrote it. Even the Adeptus Astartes, being sculpted from the Emperor's own genetic blueprint, are not free from this dichotomy. Their implants enhance them beyond the capabilities of any baseline human, yet they are still considered human enough to venerate the Emperor's suffering as a sign of divinity. What they do not realize, what they must never realize, is that their own transformation mirrors a far older one. The Emperor's body, with its rumored circuits of living gold and energy-pulsing organs, may well have been the first template. If he bore a false heart, then the Astartes bear echoes of that original heresy, unwittingly. Worse still, the sisters of the Adepta Sororitas, pure in flesh and zealous in creed, are taught to view bionics with distaste. Yet they kneel before a corpse god whose life may be sustained by nothing but circuitry and will. Their faith rests on the assumption that he suffered as a man. If he instead transcended through design, then their very foundation becomes a parody of belief, adoration for a being who betrayed the sanctity they so cherish. The ultimate cruelty lies in the silence. The Emperor, master of truth, chose deception. If he bore within himself a biomechanical core, he never spoke of it, never allowed its revelation. Perhaps he knew humanity was not ready, or perhaps he believed that faith required ignorance. Either way, he let the lie of the sacred flesh flourish, while secretly embodying its opposite. In this, he becomes not just a father to the Imperium, but its most cunning tyrant, constructing a religion that forbade the very path he once walked. A false heart, then, is not just a possibility. It is a symbol of control, of fear, of love twisted into power. The heart that does not beat may be the secret engine of humanity's entire faith and the greatest lie ever told. In the silent corridors of the Imperial Palace, beneath the cathedrals of golden skulls and the endless chanting of devotion, there are whispers carried by those who can never speak. The Adeptus Custodes, golden giants who guard the Emperor's broken shell, know more than any mortal should, and yet their lips are sealed by honor, by fear, and by love twisted into duty. Among them there are rumors. They do not write them down. They do not speak them aloud. But sometimes, in the flicker of a dying candle or the static crackle of a vox feed left too long on, the idea surfaces. The Emperor has a heart that never beat. This is not the crude heart of synthetic pumps or arterial tubes. It is something far more sacred and terrible. A core, not like the clanking mechanisms of tech priests, but a biomechanical construct so advanced it could only have been shaped by divine will or suicidal genius. The Custodes do not admit it, but some among them have tended to the Emperor's body closely enough to see that his chest never truly rose, never truly fell. Yet the sensors registered power, activity, presence. Not life in the traditional sense, but function, sustained purpose, as if his body was no longer animated by blood and oxygen, but by some silent engine buried deep within. The Mechanicum, for all its bluster and ritual, has always had a schism buried beneath its surface, between those who worship the machine as an unknowable god and those who seek its secrets as conquerors of science. Among the latter, there have long existed heretical treatises on what is called the Vita Circuitum Primaris, an undocumented schematic said to describe a system within the Emperor's body capable of self-sustaining operationality without organic dependency. A heresy, surely. And yet, the tech priests of Mars have often asked to be allowed near the Golden Throne, not to pray, but to study. They are denied, every time. By whose command? We must consider the implications. If there is indeed such a core, whether placed by the Emperor himself or grown within him through arcane means, then it must predate the Golden Throne. The throne is a prison and a sarcophagus, not the engine of his will. It holds him, barely, within the bounds of consciousness. But what if his heart, his core, was the true source of that endurance? And the throne, in its crude brilliance, merely wraps itself around that singular point of divine machinery like a cocoon around a light? Some among the darker circles of the Mechanicum speculate that the Emperor's false heart is not a singular construct, but a layered system, a core wrapped in psychic membranes, wrapped again in near-organic interfaces, with a living consciousness threaded through it all like veins of gold. This system, they claim, predates the Imperium, predates even the Age of Strife. It is not of Martian make. It is not human. It is something older, repurposed, reawakened by the Emperor in his quest to ascend beyond mortality. To admit this is to admit that the Emperor is not merely a genius, but a scavenger of lost gods, that he found this heart not in himself, but in the ashes of something older. Some even claim the core pulses in resonance with the Blackstone buried beneath the palace. If true, this would tie the Emperor not just to technology, but to the ancient secrets of the Necrontire and their war against the warp itself. A heart built to resist chaos not through faith, but through resonance, through a perfect anti-psychic symmetry. The idea horrifies the ecclesiarchy. It is why they burn the books, silence the voices, and erase the records. Because if the Emperor bears within him a core that is not of man, not of God, but of some strange in-between, then everything they teach collapses into irrelevance. The Custodes know this. The Mechanicum suspects it. And every so often, when the throne sputters, when the Emperor's psychic pulse falters, there are those who wonder, what if he is not dying? What if he is rebooting? There are rituals performed by certain tech priests, hidden in the vaults of Noctis Labyrinthus, that involve diagrams of a heart encased in circuitry. These rituals are outlawed by both the ecclesiarchy and the High Lords. Yet the diagrams persist. Why? Because they resemble something only a few have seen and fewer still survived seeing. A core of light, pulsing without sound, deep within the Emperor's chest. It is not faith that keeps the Imperium alive, it is fear. And at the center of that fear is a secret that no one can afford to reveal. The Emperor may not have a heart. He may have something better, something worse. The Golden Throne looms like a monument to agony, brilliance, and contradiction. It is not a seat of power. It is a prison throne, a necro-technological sarcophagus built to preserve a god who should have died, and a beacon to a galaxy that cannot afford to know the truth. But what is often overlooked, often misunderstood even by those who worship at its base, is this. The Golden Throne may not have been designed to save the Emperor. It may have been designed to replace something he had already lost. When the Emperor was struck down by Horus during the Siege of Terra, the wound was more than physical. It was the end of a plan 10,000 years in the making, a psychic engine of mankind's ascension brought low by a son's betrayal. What happened in that moment is buried beneath layers of myth, but the consequences are real. His body, once radiant with warp light, became a shell, his voice silenced, his will splintered. Yet his presence endured, not alive, not dead, suspended. How? The conventional understanding is that the Golden Throne, a relic from the Dark Age of technology originally built to house the Webway project, was repurposed as a life support device in desperation. But this is a lie of omission. Some among the Ordo Redactus and even certain isolated Black Library fragments suggest that the throne was always meant to be more than a gateway. It was a receptacle, an interface, a replacement. If the Emperor had a core, a biomechanical heart pulsing with his will and life, then the throne might not have simply supported his existence after Horus shattered his body. It might have integrated with or supplanted his core entirely. Imagine, in those final moments, Malcador and the Custodes dragging what remained of the Emperor's ruined form to the throne, only to find the internal systems failing. The heart, if it ever existed, no longer functioned. Not stopped, but rejected, fried, shattered by psychic backlash. That is not death in the usual sense. That is a system collapse, a crash. The throne, with its ancient interfaces and esoteric feedback systems, may have acted like a failsafe. Not a resurrection, but a hard reboot, a jarring, brutal fusion of flesh and machine to preserve the spirit flickering within. If so, the Golden Throne is not a life support device. It is an externalized core, a new heart wired into the Emperor's frame by way of psychic cabling and technological savagery. An artificial afterlife where one god's breath is imitated endlessly by circuits that don't quite understand what they're sustaining. There are signs of this in the way the throne is maintained. The tech priests who tend to it do not see it as a machine in the traditional sense. They chant to it. They fear it. They treat it not as a conduit, but as an entity. Some believe the throne has developed a mind of its own, a corrupted echo of the Emperor's consciousness lodged in circuitry that was never meant to bear a soul. A throne not just acting for the Emperor, but as the Emperor. This, too, feeds into the theory of replacement, that the original core, the fabled false heart, was destroyed during the heresy, that the throne itself was designed to step in, to assume control. And here is the most disturbing idea. What if the Emperor's mind is no longer centralized? What if it is distributed, part in the body, part in the throne, part in the warp? That would mean the Emperor is no longer a singular being, but a network. A consciousness fractured, yet operating through multiple nodes. Such a transformation would explain the erratic psychic signals emanating from the throne, the strange surges and silences recorded by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. It would explain why certain saints and psychers claim to hear the Emperor not as a voice, but as a chorus. Not a unity, but a system of overlapping identities trying to remain coherent. A divine personality running on repurposed code. This is not salvation. It is not even survival. It is entrapment. The Emperor's will, once supreme and singular, may now be caught in a loop, an eternal restart sequence built by those too desperate to let him die. His core, once his pride, is gone, and in its place hums the Golden Throne, not just preserving a god, but perhaps replacing one. The question then is not whether the Emperor had a false heart, but whether the false heart now is the Emperor. There are whispers among the more esoteric elements of the Mechanicum and the Inquisition that the Emperor's body is more than a relic. It is a map, a cathedral of bone and circuitry, flesh and fire, not merely designed for power, but to embody an entire philosophy. His internal structure, if ever fully revealed, might read less like anatomy and more like scripture, an encoded truth in sinew and steel. And at the heart of that osseous cathedral lies the most haunting question. Was there ever a place where a heart should have been? Those few who have glimpsed the Emperor's remains speak not of a corpse, but of something that defies classification. Custodes do not speak of it. The tech priests that serve the throne never describe what they touch, and the inquisitors who survive seeing him never speak again without trembling. But the tales persist. They speak of ribs not cracked but fused, as though his chest had been sculpted around something long removed. Of metallic struts spiraling out from a central cavity, empty yet active, pulsing with residual energy, as though something once rested there, and now only the ghost of its function remains. What kind of being would shape its body around an engine? Not to imitate life, but to improve upon it? There is poetry in that horror. That the Emperor's form was not just a vehicle for will, but a designed artifact, each vertebra, each organ, tailored for efficiency, durability, and resonance. The lungs may not have breathed air, but psychic currents. The spine may not have housed nerves, but data streams. And at the center, where we would expect a heart, something else entirely, a core, a matrix, a node. Such designs are not without precedent. The lost science of the Dark Age included descriptions of anatomical augmentation harmonics, procedures that integrated machinery into the very developmental biology of the host, not as replacements, but as primary systems. In this theory, the Emperor's core would not be a retrofit, but an original feature, not something inserted into a man, but something a man was grown around. He was not augmented. He was engineered. There is emotional tragedy in this, to consider that the Emperor in all his majesty may never have been truly human, that his birth was a lie, his humanity a mask, his physiology a temple not to the flesh, but to perfection. In that sense, the osseous cathedral becomes a kind of prison, a masterpiece sculpted to resemble life, yet never truly alive. His limbs, instruments of conquest, his mind, a weaponized algorithm, his chest a sacred vault. The question is not just whether he had a false heart, but whether he needed one. Among the Black Priests of Mars, there exists a heretical canticle that sings of the chamber of light within the flesh of gold. It describes a being with no heart, only a sphere of radiant circuitry that thrums with infinite recursion. In this vision, the being's emotions are not felt. They are simulated. His empathy, calculated. His love, procedural. The chamber glows with the memory of fire, not its heat. This is the God they see in the Emperor. Not one who was a man, but one who chose the shape of man for efficiency's sake. And what does that mean for his followers, for humanity, for the Imperium itself? It means that the cult of the flesh is based on a lie, that the very relic they kneel before is an impostor in form and purpose. The sacred wounds, the suffering, the imagined breath, they are all parts of a theater maintained to keep the faithful obedient. Because if they knew the truth, that their God never had a heart to break, they might stop believing. They might realize that they were designed just as he was, not to be loved, to be used. But within this tragedy lies a strange kind of beauty. The Emperor, architect of mankind's survival, may have given up the right to a heart in order to preserve ours. He became the cathedral, the machine, the lie, so that we might have something to worship, something to fear, something to follow. His body, stripped of organic warmth, becomes the template of a future no longer tied to suffering, but to design, to control, to purpose. And maybe, just maybe, the empty space where his heart should be is not a failure, not a loss, but a deliberate absence, a statement. That to be divine is to be incomplete by human standards. That to lead is to leave behind. That the heart must be sacrificed so the hand may never tremble. The Emperor was not merely a master of the material. His empire was not built with steel and fire alone, but with the raw, shifting energies of the warp, molded not through sorcery, but through sheer will. To understand the possibility of a biomechanical core within him, we must consider not just the technological, but the psychic. Could his heart have been more than machine? Could it have been a warp engine, a vessel of soul fire, forged not in metal but in soul stuff and void resonance? The warp defies our logic, yet the Emperor navigated it with terrifying precision. He bent it to his will, not as the psychers of today do, but as an architect sculpts stone. The question we must ask is, how did he survive it? How did he channel the limitless chaos of the immaterium without being consumed or corrupted? A mortal soul, even the mightiest psychers, would shatter under such pressure. But a being equipped with a stabilizing core, a nexus of psychic containment and filtration, might just endure, might even thrive. Imagine a heart that was not mechanical in the traditional sense, but a psychic regulator. A biomechanical reactor that filtered warp energy, processed it, and returned it through the body in a stable, controlled flow. This core would not simply pump blood, it would modulate soul energy. It would harmonize the physical with the ethereal, anchoring the Emperor in both realms simultaneously. Such a thing would appear as heresy to the ecclesiarchy, sorcery to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and forbidden science to the Mechanicum. But to the Emperor, it would be necessity. There is support for this theory in the peculiar way the Emperor's psychic presence is described. Unlike other psychers who shine like candles in the warp, his presence is a sun, a blinding, burning singularity around which others orbit or are incinerated. That kind of power needs control. Without a regulating system, organic, technological, or otherwise, it would tear itself apart. The Emperor may have created within himself such a system, a living psychic engine. A false heart, yes, but one that pumped not blood but divinity. Certain radical inquisitors believe this core may have been the prototype for the Astronomicon itself. That before the vast psychic beacon was constructed, the Emperor's own body performed that function, projecting a stabilizing light across the stars, guiding the nascent crusade. If so, then the Astronomicon is not just powered by psychers. It is a pale imitation of what once beat within the Emperor's chest. A dull reflection of a brilliance now lost or entombed. And then there is the Black Library. The Eldar have always feared the Emperor in a way they do not fear mere warlords. They speak of him in the same breath as their gods, of a human who pierced the veil of the warp without succumbing to its madness. Some among the Harlequins whisper that he forged a soul anchor, an object or device so perfectly attuned to the immaterium that it stabilized reality around it. If that is true, perhaps that anchor was not an object at all, but part of him, his heart. To view the Emperor this way is to step beyond our limited understandings of machine and flesh. It is to see him as an alchemical being, a fusion of disciplines long thought incompatible. His heart may have been forged not in a forge, but in meditation, in will, in sacrifice. It may have grown not from cells, but from focus, not steel and sinew, but purpose. It may have pulsed with psychic rhythm, a metronome of soul resonance that kept his vast and fractured consciousness coherent. Such a heart would not be visible. It would not be dissectable. It would be experiential. The saints who claim to feel the Emperor in their dreams might be resonating with the last psychic echoes of that core. The warp disturbances around Terra might not be a consequence of the throne, but the dying heartbeat of a soul core once capable of calming storms. And if so, then the core is not just lost, it is dying. And with it, the last true psychic bulwark of mankind. This interpretation does not invalidate the idea of a false heart. It enhances it. It elevates it beyond the technological, beyond even the mystical. It places it in the realm of psychic architecture, where thought becomes function and function becomes form. In this view, the Emperor's false heart was not a betrayal of the flesh. It was the elevation of soul into matter, a light that burned within him, constructed not by tools, but by truth. If the Emperor truly bore a biomechanical or psychic heart, a core that transcended flesh, then its echoes might still live on. Not in the ruins of Terra, not in the golden sarcophagus of the throne, but in the Primarchs. These sons were not mere commanders or generals. They were fragments of the Emperor himself. Sculpted from his genetic essence, forged with his psychic fingerprints, each Primarch might carry within them a shard of whatever terrible miracle once pulsed at the center of his being. The Primarchs are anomalies even by the standards of the Imperium's most advanced bioengineering. Each one embodies not just physical perfection, but thematic extremes. Lorgar's spiritual resonance, Magnus's raw psychic power, Ferris's metallic fusion. These traits are not coincidences. They are reflections, mirrors. Blueprints derived not merely from DNA, but from the conceptual architecture of the Emperor's own form. What if, hidden in their genetic design, lies a record of the Emperor's own internal construction? Take Ferris Manus, whose arms were transmuted into living silver that interfaced with any machine. Many dismissed this as sorcery, or as a fluke of the unknown energies of Medusa. But what if it was more? What if Ferris carried a fragment of the Emperor's core principle, the unity of metal and flesh, not in theory, but in physical mimicry? Perhaps he was born not with arms of flesh, but with arms designed to host the same kind of biomechanical synchrony the Emperor possessed. Or Magnus the Red, whose heart is said to beat in time with the warp. His body is barely constrained by material laws. He does not age. He does not breathe. He burns. Magnus may have inherited more than the Emperor's psychic talent. He may have inherited a prototype of the soul core described in heretical texts. If the Emperor's heart was once a warp-stabilizing node, Magnus may have borne a fragment of that design, making him a walking, breathing resonance chamber, until his fall. Even more subtle examples abound. Vulcan's perpetual resurrection, Corax's phase-shifting physiology, Alpharius and Omegon's hive-thought symmetry. Each Primarch seems to represent a unique function of a larger system, perhaps one that once existed whole within the Emperor. If that is true, then the Primarchs are not just sons. They are vivisections, living disassemblies of a single perfect organism. This interpretation casts their creation in a much darker light. The Emperor did not simply make 20 superhuman sons. He disassembled himself conceptually and genetically, and distributed the pieces across vessels that could serve a galactic purpose. Perhaps he hoped to create redundancy. Perhaps he hoped to hide his most vital systems. Perhaps each Primarch was a failsafe, and at the center of them all, maybe one or all, contained a shadow of the original core. Some whisper that the gene seed used to create the Astartes still carries traces of these core principles. The sanguinary priests speak of the Red Grail, a relic containing the blood of Sanguinius, said to radiate psychic energy. But it is more than that. It is warm. It pulses. It seems alive. If the blood of a Primarch can still mimic a heart, what might that say about the blood of their father? It is also worth noting the failures, the lost Primarchs. Their very erasure might have been driven not by political catastrophe, but by biological instability. What if those two contained flawed replications of the Emperor's inner core? Malfunctions, echoes that burn too hot or refuse to stabilize. If the Emperor's heart was a psychic reactor, then copying it could be catastrophic without the correct vessel. Perhaps those failures were not disobedient sons, but unstable reflections of a god's anatomy. There is sadness here, buried beneath the awe. For if the Primarchs were fragments of a divine system, they were never truly whole. They were never meant to be. They walked the stars as heroes, as monsters, as saints and traitors, but they were always incomplete, always echoing something greater, something that once beat, perhaps still beats, in silence beneath the throne. And if they carry echoes of that heart, then perhaps it is not entirely lost. Perhaps the Emperor's core, whether psychic, mechanical, or both, can still be reconstructed, not from the remnants of his body, but from the living legacies of his sons. Not resurrection, recapitulation, a heart rebuilt from the scattered bloodlines of the Primarchs. Malcador the Sigillite is a name cloaked in as much mystery as reverence. Advisor, sorcerer, administrator, friend, he was all of these to the Emperor and more. But perhaps the most important role he played was that of the witness. He saw the Emperor as no one else did. He stood beside him during the unification of Terra, aided him in the foundation of the Imperium, and, most critically, was the last to speak with him before the throne sealed shut. And yet, for all his closeness, Malcador said remarkably little about the Emperor's nature. That silence is not merely absence. It is architecture, deliberate, protective, possibly terrified. Those rare fragments that do exist, letters, apocryphal journal scraps, errant comments transcribed by scribes before the heresy, suggest a man carrying an unbearable secret. In one such fragment, he refers to the Emperor as the flame without oxygen. In another, he describes the Emperor's form as the mask of mankind's final weapon. These are not the words of a loyal retainer describing a noble king. They are the desperate metaphor of someone trying to make sense of something inhuman. We must ask, what did Malcador see? He was there, after all, at the installation of the Golden Throne. He saw the Emperor's body torn, his flesh unrecognizable, his voice gone. He is said to have helped calibrate the initial systems. He knew what was inside. Perhaps he knew what had always been inside. Perhaps he had, at some point, seen the Emperor's chest opened, not with reverence, but with urgency. Perhaps he saw the biomechanical core. Perhaps he saw it fail. There are persistent rumors that Malcador opposed the use of the throne, not because it would kill him as it did, but because it would suppress something, or someone. Perhaps he believed the Emperor's inner workings were already sufficient. Perhaps he feared that the throne would override the Emperor's core, forcing him into a passive, semi-living state. If true, Malcador's sacrifice may not have been a noble act, but a desperate attempt to prevent a catastrophic fusion. A way of buying time for a different solution, one that never came. After the throne consumed him, no record of Malcador's thoughts survived. Or perhaps they were destroyed. But the Sigillite was the keeper of forbidden truths. He founded the Ordo Malleus. He oversaw the Black Library's earliest acquisitions. He knew things not meant for the minds of men. If he remained silent about the Emperor's true nature, it was not out of loyalty alone. It was because he feared the implications. He feared what would happen if the Imperium realized that its god had once housed and perhaps lost a synthetic soul. In a rare and heavily censored commentary attributed posthumously to Malcador, he states, "The Emperor's silence is not weakness. It is the weight of understanding that must never be spoken." This cryptic line has been debated endlessly, but what if it refers not to political wisdom but to biology, to anatomy? What if the Emperor's silence masks the truth that within his chest was never a human heart, but something else, something that, if described, would undo the fragile structure of faith? There are theories that Malcador helped build the Emperor's false heart, that in the earliest days of the Unification Wars, the Emperor and the Sigillite unearthed forbidden machines, possibly even fragments of Necron or Old One technology, and used them to construct the core. Malcador's mind, already fraying under the weight of knowledge, may have been the architect of the interface. If so, then his death upon the throne was more than a sacrifice. It was an undoing. The overload of the throne may have erased his conscious memory, or worse, left him echoing in the machinery itself. There are times when the Golden Throne stutters, when its hum changes pitch. Some claim they hear two voices, one faint, one desperate. Could it be that a part of Malcador still exists within it, trying, failing to tell us something, a warning, a regret? In the end, Malcador's silence may be the loudest testament to the Emperor's inner truth, not because he didn't know, but because he knew too much. The man who knew the Emperor best said the least, and in that void we are left to wonder, did Malcador hide the secret of the Emperor's heart because it was too terrible, or because it was too sacred? Rogel Dorn was not a man prone to weakness. As Primarch of the Imperial Fists, his very soul was carved from stone, his convictions harder than the walls of the fortress monasteries he built across the stars. And yet, in the final hours of the Horus Heresy, when he ascended the shattered stairs of the Imperial Palace and looked upon the Emperor's broken body, he wept, not with sorrow but with horror. This was not the grief of a son mourning his father. It was the despair of a warrior who had seen something that unmade him. The records say little. The silence surrounding that moment is dense, suffocating. Dorn never spoke in detail about what he saw when he entered the sanctum and found the Emperor, still alive but irreparably wounded. But his actions afterward betray the truth. He changed, became colder, more zealous, less a man and more a monument to denial. Something inside him died alongside his father, not faith, but comprehension. There are those who believe Dorn saw more than blood and broken flesh, that he saw the Emperor's inner structure laid bare, that, in the ruin of the Emperor's body, the true nature of his core was revealed, not the noble suffering of a divine being, but something else, something mechanical, something alien, a heart not torn, but cracked along lines of circuitry, a chest cavity where biomechanical struts sparked and sputtered, no longer glowing with purpose. That moment might have been the true genesis of Dorn's despair, not that the Emperor was dying, but that he was never truly alive. For Dorn, who believed so deeply in the sanctity of purpose, in the glory of sacrifice, such a revelation would have been devastating. To discover that the god he fought for was constructed, not born. That the man he revered had a heart of circuitry, not of passion. The betrayal would not be in the heresy of Horus, but in the artificiality of the Emperor's essence. There is a grim account, buried in the sealed librarium of the Phalanx, of a report submitted by a junior apothecary after examining a piece of golden rib, allegedly torn from the Emperor's chest, during his final battle. The report was immediately classified, and the apothecary was never seen again. The fragment described the bone as laced with filaments of non-organic composition, displaying reactive psychic resonance when exposed to warp light. Bone that sang when touched by the soul. This kind of anatomy is not just unnatural, it is impossible by human standards, but it matches certain descriptions of failed Astartes prototype organs, those that attempted to fuse psychic amplification directly into the skeleton. Projects Dorn himself oversaw in his more desperate hours. Was he trying to recreate something he saw that day, trying to replicate or perhaps even understand the Emperor's true design? There are also whispers from within the ranks of the Silent Sisterhood. Though they never speak, they record. Their archives contain a single phrase attached to Dorn's descent from the throne room. He sees now what the heart was. No context, no elaboration, just that cryptic sentence left in a script that weeps as it burns. It suggests not just physical horror, but existential undoing. In the years that followed, Dorn threw himself into duty with pathological intensity. The construction of the fortress monastery, the refinement of siege doctrine, the rituals of the pain glove. All can be seen as acts of denial, an effort to bury the moment he saw beneath walls, scars, and sacred geometry. He needed control because in that throne room, he saw the truth. And it broke him. The Emperor's false heart, if that is what Dorn saw, was not just a secret. It was a wound carved into the soul of the Imperium's most unyielding son. Dorn did not doubt the Emperor's divinity. He doubted its meaning, and that, in a galaxy held together by blind faith, is perhaps the deepest heresy of all. To call the Emperor's heart false is not an insult. It is a revelation, a truth wrapped in paradox. If it was ever real, it did not beat like ours. It did not love like ours. It did not fail like ours. It was something beyond the curve of human understanding, an engine of intent, an artifact of will. And in its unmaking, the greatest tragedy of the Imperium reveals itself, that our God was never a man, and that our salvation was never in the flesh, but in a lie so sacred it had to be enshrined in silence. Imagine the implications. A God who needed a heart to begin with. How mortal. But a God who built one, installed it within himself, optimized it not for love or empathy, but for governance, stability, function. How terrifying. The Emperor's false heart, whether mechanical, psychic, or conceptual, was never about sustaining life. It was about perfecting it. It was not meant to feel. It was meant to endure. This is why his silence persists. This is why no one speaks of his anatomy, why his body is both the most sacred and the most forbidden relic in all the Imperium. Because if the people ever learned the truth, that their God did not simply suffer for them, but constructed himself to endure for them, they might question what else was fabricated. They might ask whether divinity is born or engineered. What makes a heart false? Is it its material, its purpose? If the Emperor replaced the biological with the biomechanical, or the psychic with the structured, then perhaps he did so not because he rejected humanity, but because he believed humanity needed something more. A lie that would not die, a God that could not falter. In this light, the false heart is not heresy. It is gift, sacrifice of selfhood in favor of symbolism. Yet this does not make it any less tragic, because if the Emperor truly bore a false heart, then he never loved as we do. His sacrifices were calculated, not felt. His sorrow was structural, not emotional. The Great Crusade, the Primarchs, the heresy, all data points in a massive equation of galactic salvation. We see in his silence a martyr, but perhaps what we worship is an architect too brilliant to weep. It is no coincidence that the most sacred rituals of the ecclesiarchy focus on his wounds, his silence, his death. They do not celebrate his birth, because his birth is a question mark. They do not study his internal functions, because his anatomy is sacrilege. They weep over his loss, because that loss allows them to hide the truth. The Emperor is not holy because he lived. He is holy because he is gone, and thus can be molded into whatever image is needed. In some of the most blasphemous archives of the Excommunicate Historicus, there are diagrams, renderings of what the Emperor's chest might contain, not organs, circles, glyphs, patterned nodes of light and darkness. Some even speculate that the heart was removed deliberately, entombed elsewhere, to prevent the Imperium from ever reverse engineering it. That the most sacred relic in existence is not the throne, but something buried, somewhere no hand dares reach. A relic not of divine blood, but of divine code. And if it exists, that heart, false, heretical, magnificent, it is not a weakness. It is a keystone. Proof that the Emperor understood what we still deny, that to build an eternal empire, love is not enough. Pain is not enough. Myth is not enough. You need something that cannot be corrupted. A core that will never break. A soul made of structured light, humming in silence, even now, beneath the rot and madness. The Emperor's false heart is the first god machine, not a weapon, not a tool, a foundation, the first brick of the future. Somewhere deep beneath the Imperial Palace, past vaults sealed since the heresy, past doors no longer remembered by the living, there may lie a chamber untouched for 10,000 years. It is not guarded by custodies or warded by psychers. It does not need protection because no one dares believe it is real. They call it the Vault of Echoes, a name whispered in the margins of forgotten cogitator files and in the dying breaths of heretic explorers. It is said to hold a single relic, an object not of gold or bone or sanctified scrap, but of design. An orb, smooth, pulsing, cold. It hums with no sound, gives off no heat, and yet when approached, some claim to feel the presence of divinity, or dread. If the Emperor had a heart before the throne, if he once housed within himself a core not of flesh but of purpose, perhaps he knew it would not survive what was to come. Perhaps he removed it, sealed it away, left only the illusion of a dying god upon the throne while his true essence waits, not for rebirth but for reassembly, not for healing but for activation. A heart is not always meant to feel. Sometimes it is a key. This final speculation, wild as it may be, captures the essence of the Imperium's great tension between faith and design, between love and function. Was the Emperor a man who made himself a god, or a god who made himself a machine? Did he build a false heart because he had no choice, or because he saw farther than any of us ever will? We are not meant to know. That is the message carved into every silence, every forbidden archive, every sanctioned execution of those who ask the wrong questions. The Imperium survives on mystery. The Ecclesiarchy needs a bleeding god. The Mechanicum needs a divine blueprint. The Inquisition needs a secret worth killing for. And perhaps the Emperor himself needs us to remain blind. Because to see the heart clearly would be to understand not just what he is, but what he was willing to become. And still, there is hope. Because if the heart was false, if it was built rather than born, then it can be built again. If it was buried, it can be unearthed. If it was scattered, it can be reassembled. Perhaps the true resurrection of the Emperor will not come from miracles, but from hands that understand what he once made of himself. Not saints, not priests, engineers, psychers, thinkers, those willing to abandon the myth for the machine, not to defile him, but to complete him. Maybe the Emperor is not dead. Maybe he is waiting for the vault to open, waiting for the echo of his false heart to be heard again in a galaxy that no longer remembers the sound. If you found yourself shaken, inspired, or unnerved by these speculations, if you believe, as I do, that Warhammer's greatest mysteries live in the shadows between canon and imagination, subscribe to the channel. Join this ongoing descent into heresy, wonder, and truth. For in the grimdark of the far future, every beat of forbidden knowledge counts.